everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Conversation with Event series, which is organized and run by Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transports, Next Generation Forum. My name is Siddharth Vasnik, and I'll be your host today. I am a volunteer with Next Generation Forum, and I work for Mott McDonald's, the company, and the work I am typically involved with is transport modeling. If you're unfamiliar with the Next Generation Forum, our aim is to support the career development of people considering establishing or pivoting their career to transport, logistics, and supply chain sector. We are also passionate to make transport and logistics more accessible to people, whatever their backgrounds or beliefs. And we plan to coordinate diversity and inclusion themed events as well as STEM activities. In the series of events, members of the Next Gen Forum will speak to professionals at the top of their field. The series will be useful to people who are establishing their careers, those pivoting to a career in these sectors, and those who would like to understand how these sectors can work better together. Today, I have the pleasure of conversing with Lawrence Penn from WSP, whose background is in future mobility. Welcome, Lawrence. I'm delighted that you are speaking to us today. Great to
Hi
have
there,
you.
pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invite.
Great. Should we start off with the questions? Does anyone have? Yeah, cool. All right. So firstly, could you take us on a journey, Lawrence, of how you got to where you are today, and if it was what you expected it to be, or was it something different? And maybe finish off by telling us what your current role is and what your focus is within that role.
Sure. So yeah, like many people in transport, I studied geography at university, and I initially went in as a physical geographer to do the BSc, thinking that I'd be really interested in volcanoes and natural hazards, etc. But I soon discovered that it was the human geography modules that interest me more. Unfortunately, within my course, there's the flexibility to sort of pivot towards that. And yeah, within human geography, sort of starting to look at spatial geography and the way that people move, and looking more and more at transport. And then yeah, I suppose through an interest in that, and had a great transport geography lecturer, sort of led me to look at the future of transport and how new technologies would impact the way that we move, and our day-to-day lives, because of course, yeah, pretty much everything that we do requires some degree of movement. And even if we're staying at home all day, goods still need to come to us. So we're relying on logistics, sort of the other side of transport. And then I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on connected and automated vehicles. And at that time, it's sort of about how we decide what decisions they make, what's the ethical way to program them so that it can be reflective of our values in society. And yeah, it got me really interested in that future transport space. And then I felt like I wasn't quite done with university. There was more I wanted to learn. I wanted to be more specialized. Geography is brilliant in that it is really broad and you can go into lots of different things, but then occasionally it can feel like you have done lots of different things. You haven't really got a specialism yet. So I did my master's at the Institute for Transport Studies in Leeds, which is where I now live. Absolutely love the city, so I stuck around. And yeah, chose lots of modules relating to future transport, and also a green logistics module run by a guy called Tony Whiting, who's a fantastic lecturer. And that's what sort of led me more into like future of logistics space, I suppose. And I actually joined WSP in 2019 as a transport modeler. I think this sort of brought me in as almost a bit of an experiment as a geographer to sort of straddle the transport modeling and transport planning teams. But I think I found that my skill sets aligned more with the planning side. Found that yeah, I didn't have that sort of highly mathematical and logical brain that a lot of modelers have. I'm very envious of. Um, but yeah, and then through transport planning, as I say, really interested in the future stuff, and I found my way towards the future mobility team after pestering them for long enough to let me in, which sort of brings me to where I am now.
Great. Can I just ask one more question? Did you mention that you did your bachelor study in Leeds as well, or was it somewhere
No,
else?
that was Sheffield Hallam.
Oh, not too far away then.
No, yeah, still Yorkshire.
Fair enough. So the next question is, do you consider future mobility as comparatively a new concept, or do you see it as an evolution of traditional transport planning or any other branch, if at all? And how is the future mobility space different or similar to conventional approaches within the consultancy environment?
Well, I think there's clearly always been a future of transport, and therefore sort of future mobility. But I do think that we find ourselves at quite an interesting time. Certainly, things are moving a lot quicker than they did in the past. Lots of the things that we learned about at university as part of this future vision of a transport ecosystem is already coming to fruition. So electric vehicles in the past sort of 5-10 years have really started to take off in a meaningful way. We're seeing real trials of connected and automated vehicles. E-scooters have hit the roads very recently and have completely revolutionized the way that lots of people move. So yeah, it's moving at a rapid pace, and I think there's a very good reason for this, and it's that climate change imperative.
Mhm,
It's requiring collective action across multiple different sectors, and really requiring us to deconstruct everything that we thought we knew about transport. It focused on the car for so many decades, and we're only starting to realize properly the impacts that that's having and trying to unpick all of it. And of course, this necessitates a huge amount of innovation to be able to create that revolutionary change in transport. And particularly within transport in comparison to other sectors, because the energy sector has managed to decarbonize quite successfully over the past 30 years or so, but transport emissions have sort of largely stayed roughly the same, and obviously that's accounting for so many more people driving, but we're still not seeing that same overall net progress.
mhm,
um, but I don't think it's necessarily an overhaul of transport planning. I think the same principles still apply in across the board in terms of decarbonisation, enhancing accessibility, but I think it's just thinking about it in new ways, particularly human-centric design, that sort of thing. So in terms of how future mobility is, I suppose, a bit different for transport planning, what we try and do is help people sort of understand uncertainty. So when new technologies, new business models come in, they bring about a raft of changes across transport, and the implications across social, environmental, economic, etc. And rather than following sort of set guidance, we go out and set to develop new guidance. So, for example, e-scooters come in. What do they mean for society? What's the ideal role that they would play within our transport system, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and sort of the car does everything, or there's too many e-scooters, they're unregulated, and they're cluttering our pavements, etc. So yeah, we tried to navigate through that uncertainty by taking that longer term view. So not just a scheme to be developed and implemented in the next 5 years. It's further on than that. It's what are the changes that are coming on the horizon, and how do we plan for them now?
all right. Uh, just a follow-up question on that. I think this sounds something similar to what you might have done or what I currently do as a modeler. So what we try to do is basically forecast the information, what we are seeing right now, and try to see if it's going to be okay in the future for different cases and future scenarios. So are you trying to upscale the data, or how do you actually see what it's going to be in the future? Do you have specific, uh, also slightly overlapping with my next question, would you like to go on discussing about the tools you use and what kind of softwares you sort of use to see the future case scenarios?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the framework that we use within the future mobility team is signals, trends, and trajectories. So we categorize all societal changes, be they technological, political, anything really. So your signals would be stuff that's happening, way off in the distance. It's the first indication that something's starting to happen. So these often tend to be quite like shiny technologies where there's loads of hype starting to be developed around them. So I don't know, it might be flying taxis, or at one point it would have been automated vehicles, drones, etc., those sorts of things. But they're not having wide scale impacts across transport yet. It's something off in the distance. Maybe
Mhm.
there's lots of venture capital going into them. Then we have our trends. So these are things that are already starting to take hold. And I think I'd say this is where the space that we operated mostly. So yeah, I suppose e-scooters to a degree, given that they're not regulated yet here in the UK. You've got your dynamic demand responsive transport. We're starting to see them being implemented quite a lot. And then you go further along into the trajectories, and you'd be looking at things like EVs, stuff that's really starting to take hold. It's having societal changes, but yes, it's impacting society, and it's starting to become part of that business as usual. So I think that's the way that we look at the future. And then more generally in transport, I think we've seen that shift away from predict and provide, the sort of the ethos of the past where we imagine a future scenario and say, right, this is what we need to make that happen. But in our team, we're moving more towards vision and validate. So it's, yeah, imagining this end state that you want to be in. So decarbonized transport
Hmm.
system, accessible for everybody, meets the needs of people. Um, but then, yeah, along the way, you're constantly sort of reconsidering how other changes that are happening across society are impacting that trajectory towards it. So if we try to predict the future, say, I don't know, we've got a forecast year 30 years in the future. If we look 30 years in the past, there's a huge amount that's happened then. None of it we'd be able to predict. You've got pandemic, work from home,
Hmm.
um, new business models. Uber comes along and makes
Yeah.
normal taxis almost redundant. So we try not to pretend that we can predict the future. We just try and take it back to first principles and work it out from there as we go, I suppose.
Interesting. So would you do you take any account of, just a follow-up question on that, do you take any account of any additional variabilities, like you cannot predict the variables which are gonna come along the way, for example, Uber. So do you sort of incorporate that level of uncertainty with your base principle? How does that work out?
Yeah, so further off into the future, looking at your signals, there's a huge amount of uncertainty around them. So we don't pretend to know exactly what impact it's going to have on society, but we can look at, and so sort of think it through logically. So I don't know, if we're thinking about drones as an example,
Hmm.
something that's sort of at the moment quite far off, we can say, well, okay, thinking through, these are the different problems we have in society currently, and then we can match the capabilities of drones to those problems and then try to understand how they might fit into the wider picture. But what we don't do is sort of, yeah, look at the shiny technologies first and go, oh, it could do this, 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 this.
Got it.
It's yeah, starting with the problem, definitely.
Thank you. Next question would be, how has the concept of future mobility evolved in the UK since its inception? What it used to be earlier on and what it is right now, if it's changed at all? What major advancements or changes do you think have occurred in the field of transport planning or any other field which have contributed to this transformation in future mobility?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it's come a long way very quickly. As mentioned, lots of those things we learned about at uni already are becoming business as usual.
Hmm.
And yeah, my team didn't even exist whilst I was studying. So it's absolutely true what they say that, education needs to give you the skills to
Yeah.
train for the jobs that don't even exist yet. So I think those transferable skills and particularly those core things like critical thinking are going to be really important to uh, yeah, helping us to navigate this extremely quickly changing job market. But of course, yeah, I mentioned, as mentioned previously, in the early days, people would focus on these shiny techs and it would develop a lot of hype. But it is, yeah, the more mature approach is to start by understanding the problem first and then only then matching them to solutions. And this is particularly important when everything is changing so quickly. And if we look at the major advancements, so I mentioned Uber.
Hmm.
Um, Before that, this business model didn't exist, and then it becomes enabled by yeah, big data and being able to compare lots of different journeys and to work out the most efficient. And actually, at the time that Uber arrived with us, it wasn't a particularly new technology. It's just it was being used in quite an innovative way. And I think another of the big changes in recent years is going to, yeah, certainly micromobility. So shared e-scooters and e-bikes on our streets. Seen a huge increase in usage, and again, how we use those is like nothing is singly good or bad. It's how you integrate them into the rest of the transport system. So using micromobility as a way of extending the catchment of public transport services rather than as a competing mode. And obviously, you only have a certain amount of control over how you do that. But by thinking far into the future, as far as we can start to, yeah, change the regulatory environment in advance of these things coming, hence the e-scooter trials that are going on at the moment. We want to understand them fully before they become fully implemented. But yeah, I think the key thing is not to have a monolithic transport mix, so not too much dependence on a singular mode. And I think, yeah, that's the lesson we've learned multiple times in the past.
Got it. Okay. As a future mobility consultant, what are some of the key challenges you face in designing sustainable and efficient transport systems? How do you anticipate addressing these challenges to ensure the code future and code mobility needs of population are met effectively? Yep.
But I think, yeah, the key thing with any new technology or, change in society is your FUDO, your fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And, we see this all the time with scathing articles around electric vehicles, for example. I think not too long ago, the Telegraph ran 8 anti-EV articles in a week, which must be beaten even, your Daily Mails and stuff. And so it makes it really difficult to win hearts and minds.
Yep.
And to a certain degree, it's inevitable. Like new technology is always going to be met with closer criticism than the norm, because they're new, but also I think especially in transport because it affects every single part of our daily lives. It's our daily commute. It's being able to see the people that we care about. It's about accessing jobs and opportunities. It permeates into every single part of society. But yeah, I think it's that closer lens that we look at transport in particular. Like take e-scooters, they are indeed more dangerous than bikes, with your smaller wheels, different center of gravity, etc. And the emerging evidence is backing that up, so we've got to be transparent. But then compare the injury rates to say those related to being in the car, and how many of those accidents are actually because of a car, etc. What about the environment is dangerous? Is it the fact that you're mixing with lots of traffic? But yeah, no one's pointing the finger at cars essentially, and you see the same with vehicle autonomy. So that's, I suppose, one of the big issues that we're looking at the moment. How safe is it? How safe does it need to be for people to trust this technology? And I think if they are equally as safe as human drivers, it won't be enough. They've got to be, it couldn't just be 10% more. They've got to probably be 10 times safer. So the bar is set very high for new technologies, which makes it difficult to bring them in. But then I think that degree of caution is a very good idea, clearly.
Yep.
And actually taking that measured approach is what ensures that there are no issues, which lets you actually bring them in. And of course, many of the concerns you've got to acknowledge are genuine and are somewhat inevitable, but I think often overblown, overstated, and many of them also make for very good clickbait.
Fair enough. Okay. Considering the increasing emphasis on sustainable practices and reducing carbon emissions, what innovative strategies or technologies are being employed in the future mobility space to promote sustainable mobility solutions? How do these initiatives align with the government's broader goals for achieving a greener and more sustainable transport system, do you think?
Well, I think you need a safe space in which you can innovate, and inevitably lots of funding as well. But I'm involved in a great project at the moment with the West of England Combined Authority.
Yep.
So they are one of 4 future transport zones across the UK. These are DFT funded innovation programs, and they vary in terms of what they cover. But in the West of England, we've got loads of different projects going on. So I think it's about £28 million overall, so loads of cash behind it. And that's funding the development of a network of 13 mobility hubs across the northern fringe of Bristol, where we'll be bringing together lots of different modes of transport, along with commercial and community services. So you are aggregating that demand into a single and hyper accessible location. then the idea is that you can move between these much more easily through the network, and this makes your journeys much more competitive than if you were using a car. And it's also of particular benefit to people who need to make more complex trips, very often women, for example, who are going to pick up the kids from school, then need to go do some shopping, pick up something from the pharmacy. And these are trips that often dot around the edge of a town, for example, rather than going in and out, which is the typical commuting patterns. So it offers people more ways in which they can travel, and enhances accessibility of key services. And then so there's going to be 13 of those across the west of England, across the northern fringe of Bristol. And then I suppose the digital version of Mobility Hubs is your Mobility as a Service app that we're developing for the region. So all of your modes in one place, and you'll be able to plan a journey, and it'll say, right, e-scooter to here, bus to the next part, then you get your train, then e-scooter at the other end. And you can pay for just a single price for that journey, and it will always give you the best price. So again, makes journey planning much easier, paying for journeys much simpler, and again, eroding that advantage that a car tends to have. There's also a dynamic demand responsive transport service that's gone live fairly recently. You can think of that as Uber meets bus. So rather than being a fixed route, it can flex depending on the demand, and it will promise to drop you off, say, within 400 meters to sort of smooth out all the, go around all the sort of housing estates, etc. And then, of course, it's the e-scooter trial, which has just been re-procured, and it will now include e-bikes and e-cargo bikes on top. So enable people to move goods as well as just themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's all supported by a transport data hub. And then there's the project that I'm principally involved in, which is looking at sustainable urban freight. So probably there's much more interest to CILT.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, most of the trials are looking at e-cargo bikes. So how can we replace vans? And at the moment, we're seeing lots of great progress in the logistics sector, where e-cargo bikes, like you've got companies like Zedify, who are expanding really rapidly and starting to pinch significant market share from some of the bigger operators. But vans don't just get used in logistics, they're in a whole host of other settings. So hospitals, universities, ports, tradespeople, etc., etc. There's heaps of them out there, but they're often not controlled by these massive fleet owners. So it's much harder to get them to all change, but they all add up to a significant proportion of those emissions. So we're looking to develop a blueprint of how it can be done, what's best practice, and bringing together all of the evidence. So not just how much money do I save, or what are the carbon emissions, which in honesty, lots of people don't really care about when they're procuring a fleet. It's what does it mean for the van drivers who have to become riders? Will they still do it if it's raining? So bringing together all those different things, and so they've got all the information they need to make the switch. And then, on top of that, we've got the shared use electric cargo bikes, so making them available on street alongside these e-scooters and e-bikes. And for the first time, we'll be able to move goods as part of a shared service in the west of England. And it'd be really interesting to see how people use those, be it carrying shopping, children, but also ad hoc use by local businesses, maybe removing the need for them to run a van. And there's others, but I won't spend too much time talking about them all.
Interesting initiatives, and
Yeah,
list could go on.
loads going on there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, the point I suppose I'm trying to make is that these innovation programs, where you just got the space to think about things and to learn what works, but also what doesn't work, so that people don't go back and waste money on trying to go down that same rabbit hole. But I think they're proving incredibly effective, and we're looking forward to reporting back our finding to the Department for Transport, and then hopefully, as I say, everyone will be creating that blueprint, figure out how to do it well, and then everyone else can follow suit.
Sounds great. Just a follow-up question. Across all the range of initiatives you've just mentioned, what proportion of it would you say are adapted or sort of an inspiration? For example, if you talk about cargo bikes, I think a lot is going on in Netherlands, I presume, in the same space. Do you think a lot of inspiration has been taken from other models elsewhere in the world, or do you think we are also coming up with original ideas and sort of developing new ideas based on the current scenario, what we are seeing in the UK?
I'd say it's a bit of both. I mean, clearly over on the continent, they're a lot further along in many aspects of sustainability than we are.
Hmm.
But I think you also have to consider, yeah, this innovation in context. So what works in the Netherlands, say, where they already have a very well-established cycling
Yep.
culture and heaps of infrastructure where, kids can cycle to school without parents worrying. That's a very different problem
Yeah.
to what we have in the UK, where it's much more difficult. And actually what we're finding more and more is the weather's a huge barrier, which we can't really do much about. So it might be that you need additional incentives in order to encourage that change. So, I don't know, providing your van driver who's become a cargo bike rider with a voucher to get a meal at a cafe because they can't sit in their van, have a sandwich, read a newspaper at lunch anymore. So understanding those behavioural change aspects. Um, Culturally as well, we're just different, perhaps slightly less amenable to change. Maybe that's unfair. Um, but yeah, similarly, our transport networks are built differently. Rail travel in some countries on the continent is super cheap, so it's a viable
Hmm.
option. But here, it's just loads of people are priced out of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what do you do instead? Um, so we can borrow ideas from other people, but it's all got to be considered, yeah, within the UK context.
Thank you for that answer. Could you also please elaborate more about safe space and what do you go looking for while considering a safe space to sort of create that model? And then, yeah, what is the rationale of choosing a safe space?
Yeah, so I think referring to safe space, it's I guess a working environment and a working ethos which says, we need to try this because we don't know if it works or not. And
Yeah.
if it doesn't, that's not a terrible thing. We've still learned something. And it means being able to commit uh, fairly large amounts of time to actually making things work. I mean, taking the example of e-cargo bikes that I'm quite close to, there's lots of e-cargo bikes out there that have been funded by local councils and they sort of go, right, see how you get on, tell us how much you've been using it, that sort of thing. But there isn't necessarily always the support that they need to guide them through the change or to properly discuss at a technical level how that vehicle can replace a part of their fleet or how it fits into a wider fleet, etc. And then there certainly isn't going to be the resources to do detailed monitoring and evaluation, understanding things like routing efficiency, what's the specific advantage of an e-cargo bike over a van, calculating in a defendable way how much carbon emissions have been saved, and overall fleet efficiency. Maybe it's freed up an electric van that was being used around the city centre because it's you don't have to pay a zero emission a what they're called clean air zone charge.
Yeah.
But now you can use that for your longer journeys where it can actually save more carbon emissions and use your e-cargo bike for the city centre. So yeah, understanding that bigger picture rather than just going, here's your bike, see how you get on with it.
Mhm.
But as I say, it requires a lot of funding and a lot of people's time, so it's not always possible. But that's why I think we need to take these innovation programs seriously because they're really valuable, and as I say, they give you that space to think about these things properly.
Thank you. Um, Now, the next question is, what has been the highlight of your career so far? What do you consider your favorite project till now? The most interesting one, and yeah, you loved working on it so far.
Yeah, well, I don't want to bang on about e-cargo bikes too much, but as you can tell, it is the trials that we're running with the West of England. I think it feels like whenever we speak to people about e-cargo bikes, particularly outside of transport, you always see them getting big excited about them. They're completely new, especially if you show them a four-wheeler e-cargo bike, say that looks almost more like a little van.
Yeah.
It changes their perceptions of things, and they start to think, oh God, yeah, I could do it that way. So I love spreading the gospel around e-cargo bikes. And yeah, it's also led to various opportunities like I attended European Transport Conference in Milan last year.
Mhm.
So really lucky to be able to do that. And I think that's thanks to working in a relatively new area that people do find quite interesting, hopefully. And yeah, so that's probably the highlight. But we're not done yet. There's still much to learn. So
Fair enough.
yeah.
I think some of your cargo bike enthusiasm is rubbing on off me as well.
Good.
Interesting stuff.
I'll talk at you for hours. You
Yeah,
might
yeah,
careful what you wish for.
yeah. um, as a future mobility consultant, what personal changes have you noticed in your life that have been influenced by your professional role? For example, yeah, you would not go grocery shopping on a bike usually, but after being involved in the space of cargo bikes, maybe you might consider taking your bike on the road every now and then, maybe things like that. Do
Mm.
you have any changes?
Well, I mean, for starters, I won't stop talking about e-cargo bikes and transport. Um, but I think, yeah, the job certainly made me very passionate about transport and decarbonisation in general, and of course that does permeate into the rest of your life. And I think it goes back to that point we mentioned earlier around the fact that it does impact everything. You know, it's how you get to work, it's how you enjoy your spare time with others, it's how you meet people, and it's how you access opportunity, and it shapes your entire life. So I really enjoy thinking about any issue like social, political, economic, whatever, through the transport lens, and to see the specific role that transport plays in it, and how, and particularly thinking about the future, how these new developments could change all of that. Um, of course, whilst ensuring that you're maximising all the benefits, whilst ensuring that we don't have another car episode that we have to unravel. Um, but certainly, in terms of making sustainable choices, um, but also recognizing when you don't. None of us are perfect. I still drive. I was raised in a house that loved cars,
Hmm.
and watching Top Gear and all the rest of it. But recognizing that, it whilst it has become this social phenomenon, and it's as useful as much as it is a status symbol for lots of people, it's the role it has to play is obviously changing. But you've got to understand that, particularly when talking to Generation X, for example, the boomers, that they're going to have a completely different view of transport than we do. So no matter how passionately we talk about transport, they've had a completely different lived experience and aren't going to see it our way. So one part of transport that I'm really interested in is that messaging part. It's how you can win hearts and minds, and create those changes that we want to see towards decarbonisation, without it just sounding like some kind of, oh, here come the young people again trying to get us to change everything. And how can we make transport resonate with everyone is what I've become quite interested in.
Right. Um, Finally, what are your top three pieces of advice that you've picked up in your career as a future mobility consultant, and that if you could go back, you'd give to your former self? Yep.
Good question. I think I've always found it useful to always have a bit of a side project on the go. So call it CPD, or even be involved with CILT Next Gen, etc. I think it's very often those extra things that open doors, and gets you away from the day-to-day project work, and lets you see other bits and pieces. One thing I did that was really good, actually related to that, is Future Transport Visions Group, which I'm happy to plug. But if you've got a brilliant idea that needs a bit of funding, or teaming up with some other brainy people to bring it into reality, though you can apply for funding. I think I got about £5,000 to buy a load of data for an automated vehicle project that was actually my master's dissertation, but I wanted to continue working on it. And then that's opened loads of other doors and presentations, and like presenting it to government, that sort of thing. So do those extra bits, the extracurricular stuff. That's really always going to be really useful, and helps, I think, you stand out from the crowd a bit as well. Second piece of advice would be don't ask, don't get. I asked to go to Milan and they said yes. So, but they weren't just going to hand me that on a plate. And I think finally, cheesy one, but do what makes your heart shine. Find something that you're really passionate about, and I think it's that passion that will drive you through, and it won't feel like work too much, and you'll love it. And can't ask for more than that, can you? So.
Awesome. Uh, think we finished well within time. I'll just pick out a question from the chat. Stephanie says, "Hi Lawrence, it's great hearing what you do in the sector with regards to sustainable and urban freight. I have a few questions." She says, "No pressure, answer what you wish." Uh, so the first one is, as far as you are aware, is WSP the leader on this topic, or are other consultancies also interested in the freight elements of transport? She personally thinks that she doesn't hear much about it.
Yeah, I mean it's a problem across the board, isn't it, that freight never quite gets a look in the same way that passenger transport does. Um, I'm sure other consultancies are looking at it. As far as I'm aware, there are others with freight teams. But I'd like to think that what makes our offer a bit more unique is, bringing that future mobility element into it. And I think councils really struggle with freight because it's something that's so private sector led. It's something that
Mm,
sort of happens to them. And things like data, it's all commercially sensitive, so they're not going to share it with, an authority in the same way that they might share bus patronage, for example. So yeah, helping clients bridge that gap and think about the future of freight. Now we're starting to see more freight strategies come through now, new modes coming into freight, so cargo bike strategies. There's the cargo bike action plan recently released by Transport for London. So lots happening in this space. So we are starting to hear about it, but I agree, yeah, historically we've not heard a lot.
just a follow-up question on that. When you say that councils sort of struggle with the freight, uh, I think whenever a project is led within the freight sector, where do you think the problem solving originates from? The problem originates from? Is it from the private sector, or does it the council goes that we need some change over here? And yeah, where do you think the problem is coming from? And yeah,
Yeah, so I think, well, lack of data first and foremost, which means that the council is unable to make any
yeah,
kind of, yeah, informed decisions. They can, you know, uh, a- apply certain principles. Extra capacity means goods move quicker, but then it's induced demand, and it's the same problem as passenger transport. But I think when you speak to the operators, your 3PLs, they'll say, look, we're as efficient as we can be. We're operating within this sort of domain that you've given us, essentially, and we'll make it as efficient as we can. So when you bring in new challenges for them, like clean air zones, I think they can see the benefit that these things have,
yeah,
and then they have to adapt and buy electric vehicles into their fleet and change their distribution models, etc. But yeah, they can only work within the domain they're given. So I think it does require some leadership from the public sector, and being able to think about and to provide that link with industry as well, and to understand the impact that often largely passenger focused interventions can have on freight. And then they'll hopefully find that freight doesn't just happen to them, and it's a bit more consultative.
right. Next question is, I think you already sort of have touched up on the answer to this question, but I'll still uh, ask it. Are you working with local council only, or are the service providers, are you working with service providers as well?
So through the Future Transport Zone I mentioned, the trials that we've got there, so we're working with the NHS, University of Bristol, University of West of England, Port of Bristol, hopefully Unite students very soon as well, who do the student accommodation. So we
Yep.
work very closely with private sector, but it's, yeah, sort of through the combined authority. But then our freight team, which are sort of, one foot in, one foot out, they do work with the freight operators much more closely. Um, yeah, so mix of public and private.
Good mix of people. Yeah. Uh, the next question from Stephanie is there stakeholder engagement and behavior change conversation going on with all the parties involved?
Yes, so before we start the trials, we chat with lots of people across, say, if we take the NHS, for example, so we spoke to their sustainability staff, like the sustainability officers who are in charge of transport, also their fleet managers, but then also the operational people who work, say, within the IT department. And they've all got different priorities. So your sustainability person just wants everything to be decarbonized, basically. Your IT manager just sort of wants to make sure that everyone's computers work. And then, your fleet person just wants to ensure that the drivers are happy. And often these priorities don't necessarily align with each other. And their organizational structures don't necessarily mean that they can work together effectively. They're not used to working together in many cases. So our job in facilitating the trials is to bring these people together and to bring them together with people like e-cargo bike servicing mechanics and people who offer specialist insurance products, but then also with the council. As I say, none of these people normally work together, but they need to make these trials happen. So I think that's our role within it. And in terms of behavioural change, within our team, Future Mobility team, we have a behavioural science specialist. So he's really good at really dissecting people's behaviors, what makes them tick, what motivates decisions, and we're bringing him in to look at specifically that piece around drivers becoming riders. Um, you know, Unlike in logistics where you've got people with about 2% body fat, jumping on e-cargo bikes, super keen cyclists. Not to be too general, we're talking about van drivers. Then some of them are a bit older, perhaps, and they wouldn't yeah, I can't speak for all of them, but they wouldn't always be the first people to think, yeah, I'm going to jump on an e-cargo
Yeah.
bike. But clearly in this transitional phase, we're going to need thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to do that. Potentially, we can't just fire them all and get cyclists in. So understanding that, not making their lives a misery through the trials, and essentially making it stick. Because as soon as we're not involved anymore after the year-long trial or so, we want them to carry on using it. And it's got to be elective. So
Future mobility space is coming across as really considerate of of the clients.
well, we have to be, yeah.
Yeah. How, as you mentioned earlier, that your projects are some of your projects are based in west of England. Stephanie wants to know if you're tracking and evaluating the study and trials around Bristol.
Yes, so we've got comprehensive monitoring and evaluation strategy comprising of GPS trackers. So both the vans and the e-cargo bikes are being tracked. So we track the vans to get a picture of the business as usual over about 3 months. So yeah, to build a picture of their daily activities, how far they go, how fast they travel, etc., how much fuel's been burnt. And then when we bring the e-cargo bikes in, we can measure a reduction in van usage, but then also tracking those e-cargo bikes. And by producing heat maps and developing like routable base map layers, which have sort of e-cargo bike specific speeds on them, because they can be up to about 60% faster in traffic, for example. We can model and observe the efficiencies of e-cargo bikes from that operational perspective. Can they get the job done quicker? Can they park close to their destination and not have to rely on a loading bay and then walk 100 meters to their destination? So really understanding at the street level what the efficiencies are, and then measuring them and reporting on them. But then also I mentioned the behavioral change piece, so understanding that more qualitative side of behavioral change and of organizational change. And through that, to do that, we do daily surveys, which capture various metrics like were there any issues, how would you rate the overall performance, what capacity did you use today, and also speaking with operational staff, so people looking after all the drivers, riders, what are their views of it? Is it causing them a pain managing 2 different maintenance contracts when before they just had to look at a van? And then also sort of quarterly or every 6 months or so, in-depth interviews to really understand those human motivations behind the trials, and winning those hearts and minds. What can we do to make this work? Is it a voucher for a coffee, or do you need a modification to the bike, or do you just need a big coat? How can we help?
So, another question from Stephanie. When you speak about goods, does your work differentiate between perishable goods and other less time sensitive ones? Yeah.
Yeah, so whole host of goods really. So at the Bristol Royal Infirmary, working with the NHS, they're delivering clinical samples. So yeah, very time sensitive and sort of relatively high value goods. But no, we don't necessarily differentiate. I mean, we think that cargo bikes are pretty suitable for most types of goods, and we're seeing more and more innovation within that sector as well, for even having refrigerated units on the back for yeah, very perishable goods, I suppose. But yeah, really versatile mode, and actually just being able to move quickly within the urban centre solves a lot of problems relating to perishability.
Interesting. Stephanie says sorry about hogging the Q&A session.
Thank you for the question, Stephanie.
I think Lawrence would be more than happy to answer more questions on LinkedIn if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to us, Lawrence. It was a pleasure talking to you and loads of learning we have to do here. Especially, I'm gonna dig in more in the e-cargo bike space or
Good, it
cargo bike
works.
space. Yeah. Awesome. We'd like to stop the recording over here.